Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev about the war in Ukraine. In today's podcast, this is the 52nd week of war in Ukraine, and this is the last week of February 2023. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about that Russia keeps attacking Ukraine using air forces and drones, first anniversary of Russian full scale of war, and visit of Joe Biden to Kiev. And we will talk about Putin's speech at the 1 year anniversary of Russian invasion. In its aggression against Ukraine, Russia uses up to 40 airfields located on the territory of Russian Federation, Belarus, and the temporarily occupied Crimea. Russia will obviously continue their violent mobilization as they need manpower. You see how many personnel the enemy lost during the fierce fighting in Donbass and the towns like Bakhmut and Solidar. It has already been calculated that in the month of the hot phase of the war, which began in the eastern direction, the Russians lost as many personnel as the whole armed forces of the average European country, for example, Lithuania or Finland. In February, the numbers will be even more dire for the Russians. Therefore, it is obvious that they will have problems in terms of manpower because now the trained army is being destroyed and the mobilized ones still need to be trained. As for massive shelling of the energy infrastructure, it's clear that the Ukrainian energy industry has already adapted to such a confrontation with the enemy, quickly mobilizing brigades and restoring damages. The daylight hours are longer and daily energy consumption is decreasing. The enemy saw that the goal was not achieved, so perhaps there will be a decrease in attacks on energy infrastructure facilities. However, it is possible to expect strikes on other important objects, such as transport infrastructure or hydrotechnical structures. Therefore, the Ukraine armed forces will strengthen soon because newly trained Ukrainian soldiers are being trained in the European Union and they will come back soon to the front lines. And together with them, the arrival of anti aircraft, anti missile systems such as SAMPT and Patriot air defense systems are coming. This is exactly what we need against Russian ballistics and certain types of cruise missiles, like X-22. It will help Ukraine to protect priority objects and infrastructure from the Russian strikes. The fact is that we cannot cover thousands of square kilometers of our territory with available weapons. No major country in the world has a solid air defense system or anti aircraft missile systems on its borders or throughout its territory. You know, this is impossible. We continuously cover the territory with radars. However, the targets can disappear from the radar because they fly very low using the topography of the area. In particular, drones enter riverbeds and fly along them where the targets are barely visible to radar devices. By the way, missiles also can fly along the riverbeds and also can disappear from the radar for a while. They are designed to fly close to the land surface, which makes hard for the Ukraine air defense system to track and spot them. No major country in the world has a solid such a perfect, or I would say ideal systems. So, when Russia launches the Shahid drones, our fighter jets is taken into the sky, mobile fire groups work to destroy them as well. And along the tracking route, they destroy these drones one by one. The fact is that Shahid drones attack in groups and then separate each on a specific target. Therefore, there are many nuances there. It's not that simple. Let's say if approximately few dozens of Shahid 131 136 drones flew into the direction of capital of Ukraine, Kiev, and only half of them arrived. It means that our forces destroy them in the area of their responsibility. All available fire means are engaged, including mobile fire teams or fighters. And if a certain number of drones breaks through, they are already shut down on the approaches to the capital. In other regions, it works the same way. Beat down where it's possible. It's clear that air defense equipment is located on the approaches to residential buildings, but even if the target is hit, I would say 10 kilometers from Kiev, then it can fly by inertia and fall anywhere. Here, unfortunately, the consequences of anti aircraft combat are unpredictable. This is what happened on the border with Poland, where, if you remember, on November 15th of 2022, two people were killed by a rocket. This is how it happened on the border with Moldova, where fragments of rockets were discovered at different times because the enemy deliberately uses the territory of the state as well as the border river, the Dniester River, along which, by the way, the Russians also launch missiles. And, as you know, Russian missiles have already flown over the territory of Romania. In its aggression against Ukraine, Russia uses dozens of airfields located all over the territory of Russian Federation, Belarus, and the temporarily occupied Crimea. Despite the fact that the enemy suffered significant losses in aviation, currently the Russian forces still have almost 300 planes and the same number of helicopters. Russians keep replenish its destroyed planes with the new ones. As of today, Russia has approximately the same aviation group as it was in the beginning of the invasion. Therefore, the question here is not about the planes, but about the number of weapons that the Russians can afford to use against Ukraine. For example, they still have many hundred of Kh-22 missiles, and everyone counts the number of X-101 and X-555 missiles from the beginning of strikes on critical infrastructure facilities. Other missiles, for example Kh-59 and Kh-31, are also not cheap at all. Therefore, it makes no sense to take a large number of planes into the air. Now, fighting in aviation units is a pair of planes, maybe a squadron. Let's say the Russians engaged 10 or 12 planes for each attack in a separate direction in the first month of the aggression. And at the same time, they suffered huge losses because they thought that the sky was under their control. They flew, but they were beaten because they became victims of their own propaganda, listening to the reports that Russia has already destroyed the entire Ukrainian Air Force and the sky is totally open. Therefore, even now, we should not expect any mass provocations because the Russians understand very well that they will be destroyed because air defense means are being depleted, but at the same time, they are being strengthened. The ground forces have many different manpads. The Gepard anti aircraft self propelled artillery system. There are Crotile air defense systems, Iris T, Nassams, and SAM and Patriots are on the way. Thanks to our Western allies, Ukraine received many air defense systems to protect the infrastructure facilities, the cities, the towns, the villages of Ukraine. Last week, it was a huge news for Ukraine. The US President Joe Biden visited Kyiv and showed unconditional support for Ukraine. This visit was very important for Ukraine and a bad sign for Russia. The trip, which was not announced in advance, came as Ukraine prepares to mark the 1 year anniversary of the full scale Russian invasion that began in February 24 of last year. This sends an important signal to Moscow that the United States and its partners will continue to support Ukraine. I will remind you the fact that it's believed that allies were able to win both in the First and the Second World Wars only because the United States entered this war. If we take the entire history of visits of the United States officials to Ukraine, they testify that Ukraine was not even in the first five countries that states preferred. In general, the attitude towards Ukraine was not too positive at all, let's say, especially in such critical moments. However, we didn't forget that Ukraine got rid of its nuclear status largely due to US pressure in 1994. By the way, American President Bill Clinton visited Ukraine, and it took place in the airport of Kiev, Borispol. His foot didn't even go outside of the airport. He was not even interested. He didn't show much respect to Ukraine because Ukraine was a poor country and with no potential. But we must remember that it was America that exerted the greatest pressure for Ukraine to get rid of its status as a nuclear power. That is, in the history of our relationships, there are not only positive moments, but also a long of negative moments. Despite this background, Biden's visit stands out very much, is absolutely positive. During his visit to Kiev, Joe Biden openly challenged Russia's unrealistic expectations of destroying the unity of the West and make it clear that the time is not on Putin's side. Standing next to President Zelensky, the US leader promised long term American support for Ukraine. He said, "Freedom is priceless. It is worth fighting for as much as it takes." At the same time, Putin gathered all the governments due the first anniversary of war in Ukraine. Moscow was celebrating, had concerts, acting like they have a good mission in Ukraine and keep brainwashing people with its lies about the war. An analysis of Putin's speech before the Federal Assembly on the anniversary of the beginning of the Great War. First, everyone expected how Putin would determine the results of the war for the year and strategic goals for the future. But most of the speech is information about socio-economic and humanitarian development in which there was no news. Therefore, when analyzing a speech, it is worth determining not what is said, but what is not said. Second, a year ago, Putin declared that he was going to instantly destroy the clown drug addict regime of President Zelensky, carry out the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. That is, the goal was announced. Many times Putin had stated that special operation is proceeding according to the pre-approved plan. A year has passed, and it's clear that the goals declared by Putin have not been fulfilled, and the strategy has led to defeats. But there was not a single word about the new or old goals and strategies. Next, Putin didn't even mention the number of human losses in this war, although the number of casualties is a key factor that determines the effectiveness of actions and prospects of the war. Since March 25 of 2022, the Russian authorities have never reported any losses. According to the calculations of the Western countries, all wars of the USSR and Russia after the Second World War combined didn't cause as many losses as 1 year of Putin's war in Ukraine. The next, no assessments of the expediency and effectiveness of the military actions of the Russian Federation for the year. Were there any defeats? What was the reaction of the defeats? Who is responsible? Regarding the war, Putin stated only two specific pieces of information. First, every 6 months, every Russian occupier must receive a 14-day vacation. People, hundreds of people dying, and he's been talking about a vacation. And as we know, 70% of people who went to the war, they will never get any vacation. That is, the terms of the war have not been announced, but it will be long for years. Secondly, Putin talked about the program for the development of the army in 2022-2025, introducing changes, strengthening investments and benefits to the defense industrial complex for rapid rearmament. rearmament. Next, regarding the fall, he spoke about regarding the foreign policy. Putin announced the suspension of participation in the agreement of the limitation of strategic offensive weapons. That is, a symbolic step regarding the break with the countries of the West, which in fact took place long ago. Putin said that Russia will invest money in joining the occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia. So, what the conclusions of that speech? First, Putin will not declare war on Ukraine and the West. Putin is creating an environment of the permanent martial law in Russia to reconfirm his own power. And this martial law is not tied to any goals and strategy. It can last for many years. His doctrine can be called the circle of enemies. Second, Putin is going to conduct active hostilities for a long time with significant losses of Russian troops, so the information about Russian casualties is the most painful for him. He is ready to talk about the conflict with the West, even without the fall of GDP, but not about the victims that arose as a result of his poor decisions. He fears responsibility not for the lives of citizens, but public recognition of his military weakness and inability to achieve success in aggression. And the last one, for Putin, the controllability of the army is important, not its efficiency, because in a permanent war, the power will not change, but on the contrary, it will concentrate. Putin has no criteria for evaluating hostilities from a military point of view, so the state of affairs in the army is not needed as long as the army maintains control. And personnel losses are not a problem for a totalitarian country. Critical losses will become a problem for the Russian command only if it starts to cause problems with mobilization. So this week, on February 24 of 2023, Ukraine marked 1 year since Russia started the war, the full scale of war. If you remember, Ukrainians, we all say that the war started not in 2022, but in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea Peninsula. So Russia started the war not only against the Ukrainian nation, but also against the democratic values of the civilized world. The results of this aggression have been devastating to the country and also have significantly affected neighboring countries. Around 10 million Ukrainians have left their homes, and 8 million have been forced to leave the country in search of a shelter. Almost 1,000 children have suffered injuries, and 500 children have been killed. Despite the United Nations assessment, Ukraine has lost many more than 8,000 civilians. This number must be at least doubled or tripled to be accurate. In addition, Ukraine's economy has been thrown back 15-20 years with close to 1 trillion in damages, which will take at least 10 years to recover from. As we know, the Ukrainian government cannot disclose the number of soldiers killed during the war, and we understand the reasons for this. But it is not around 15 or 20,000 of dead soldiers as it been reported. According to Ukrainian army officer who defended the Kiev region, in the first month of the war, Ukraine lost around 8 to 10,000 soldiers in the battles for Hostomel, Bucha, Borodyanka, and Irpin, which are suburbs of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. When the aggressive country started the war, the ratio of Ukrainian military equipment to Russian equipment was 1 to 10. This all indicates that more people have been killed on the Ukrainian side than is now understood. If we proudly said that Ukraine armed forces have killed or injured 200,000 Russian troops, this number unfortunately is near the number of Ukraine's losses. This genocide against the Ukrainian nation will never be forgotten or forgiven. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope you enjoy it. Please share with your friends and listen to our earlier podcasts.